All right, so I'll continue. I love that it looks like both you and I are in the same time zone, just with how dark this room is. It's like, yeah, Grace, you definitely did better with that. Right, as people are trickling in, it is now 12:04, so I'm inclined to just kick us off. As always, thank you for joining the Australian Behavioural Science Meetup, especially over your lunch break or whatever time zone you may currently be hiding in. As always, regardless of where you are, I do want to acknowledge the elders past and present. In my case, because we are on Gadigal land. If you are on different land, please take a moment to appreciate the elders past and present. Also, as always, we are sponsored by, I don't know where the sponsor message is hiding, but it's not showing up, but it will appear in the chat for everyone to see. But we are sponsored by UTS Ventures. More of them or about them in the chat below. And then I also have the absolute pleasure of introducing you to, well, I would pronounce it as Zarak, but I don't think that's essentially how it is pronounced. It's a very European way of pronouncing it. But the beautiful gentleman here on the screen leads a behavioral science team within a large US investment firm, which we will not disclose for purposes, unless, of course, you do that yourself. Has experience spanning industry, academia, and philanthropy. So yes, he is a better person than all of us. He is also a senior behavioral researcher at Duke University, so he's also more intelligent than us, and is also a behavioral science fellow at the University of Penn, or just UPenn for those in the know. He's also an editor and co-author, because somehow and somewhere he found the time, of the books Building Behavioral Science in an Organization and Behavioral Science for Development. For those of you who are super keen on the intersection between BSci and development, I would absolutely recommend that book. I thought it was an absolutely amazing read. And it also has insights from several experts across that realm. That's absolutely amazing. Now, we're not talking about that book today, but if you have an interest in learning more about the intersection between BSci and development, do let us know. Super keen to have Zarak back, or find one of the many fabulous authors, co-authors, editors in that book to have that discussion with. But we are going to be talking about the first book, because as I'm sure there is many people here with us today who are behavioral science enthusiasts or professional behavioral scientists in both an academic or professional sense, corporate sense, if you will, that are thinking about what the ideal behavioral science unit could look like, how you integrate that into your organization well, with the emphasis on well. And our speaker today can absolutely tell you how to do that. So I'm assuming that is exactly what he will be doing. So take out your notepads, your pens, your papers, your iPads, and let's start learning.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Although, if anything, I think you've set expectations much too high. Thanks all for joining. Great to be with you. And yeah, so today I was thinking we could chat through some of the concepts and insights that we wrote about in a book that we published a few years ago called Building Behavioral Science in an Organization. So in just a second, I'll pull up some slides to kind of talk us through that. I think we've got a pretty good group here for like discussion as well. So if you have questions along the way, or something that you want to share, feel free to pop it in the chat. And then we'll try to save plenty of time at the end for more discussion. So if you have specific questions about your own organization or an initiative that you're working on, I'm happy to kind of chat through that as well when we have time. So with that, I will pull up these slides. I think you all should be able to see that. Grace, can you give me like perfect, awesome. Okay, so building behavioral science in an organization. Brought to you by, these are all the authors. So I served as an editor of this book, and I authored a couple of the chapters, but you'll see here the full list of people who wrote different chapters based on their own expertise. So some people wrote about the application of behavioral science to a specific domain, like marketing or product design. Others wrote about the strategy of how you might structure a team in different ways. So I'm kind of acknowledging them here, and we'll pull from some of their wisdom as we walk through. So with the book and this talk kind of presupposes you already know what behavioral science is, so I'm kind of skipping that part. I'm assuming with this being the behavioral science meetup, everyone has at least kind of a cursory understanding of that. And what we will focus on is really kind of three things. So why do organizations use behavioral science in the first place? Where do they use behavioral science, and how they use behavioral science? And I'll say like the bulk of the conversation, the time will really be spent on this third one. How do they use behavioral science? So with that sort of prelude, I'll jump into why do organizations use behavioral science? You all probably kind of already have your own answers to this, or intuitions at least. But broadly, I think that organizations use behavioral science to improve insights, to improve decision making, and to improve the culture of the organization. And probably like kind of in that order. Insights really is the focus on improving a product, improving a service, improving an experience. Typically, that's something that informs strategy, or it influences design in a meaningful way, that has an impact to the bottom line of the organization. So if this is a business, usually that means it's, you're increasing revenue in some way, you're reducing costs, you're reducing risk, something like that. In a nonprofit or in government, it means that you're probably improving the effectiveness or the impact of a program or a policy. So that's probably like the first thing that an organization thinks of when they think of why they might use behavioral science. It's usually like the most compelling reason, and that kind of becomes important later when we think about how you structure a team and what they do. The second, around decision making, improving decision making, this is essentially like a byproduct of doing a behavioral science process. So a lot of you will probably have had this experience where you walk into a meeting with a stakeholder or a senior leader, and they've asked for behavioral science help with something. And one of the first questions that you typically ask is, well, what are you trying to achieve here? And usually the answer, at least initially, is fairly high level, right? Something like, well, we want to improve the experience, or we want to increase engagement with our product. And that's a great starting point. You'll likely ask, okay, well, specifically, what does that look like? And if you go around the room, everyone will have a different answer as to what that means. So when you are using behavioral science as a process, that means that you're getting pretty specific about what are the behaviors that you're trying to change, what are the levers that you might use to change that behavior, what's the outcome that you're trying to influence, and how you're going to measure this. So that level of specificity often improves decision making for leaders within an organization. So I think this is often like this sort of second reason why an organization might use behavioral science. And third, culturally, like this is less about like an internal culture initiative, like for like an HR initiative or human capital initiative. And more what I mean here is that by shifting your organization to be more, to think more in terms of exploration, research, experimentation, you start to think in terms of hypotheses and testing and validation. That is often a pretty big like culture shift, or really almost like business, like operational shift for an organization. So it ends up changing some of the dynamics within the organization. So it tends to be less about who can be the most compelling in pitching an idea, and because you're validating ideas in a way that's much better, right? So it can democratize ideation in a way, and have like a cultural impact on the organization. So feel free to pop in the chat other reasons why you think organizations use behavioral science. I'm curious to see your ideas. But these are kind of the three big buckets. And again, I'll sort of emphasize and anchor on the first one here of like improving insights, which really means like better strategies, better products, better services, better experiences that have a measurable impact to to the mission of the organization. So then, where do organizations use behavioral science? I've seen it in a bunch of different places. These 8 are kind of the top ones that I think of, and several of these were chapters that we wrote about in this book. I've combined a couple here just sort of for ease, but the first is design and marketing. So again, thinking about like insights and the application of insights. Typically, you're applying that to the design of a product or a policy with the intention of changing somebody's behavior, the person that's using it. Often you might partner with marketing as behavioral science. This has a couple like benefits. Marketing already typically is the part of the organization that is the most fluent with running experiments, with maybe the exception or a similar situation with like digital products sometimes, but not always. Often you'll see behavioral science show up in like a consulting part of an organization or within operations. So that might be like kind of an external consulting group where you've added a behavioral scientist to work with a client, or an internal operations group that's almost like an internal consulting group that's working on efficiencies and improving processes and policies within the organization itself. You'll often see behavioral science partnered with data science. You can think of this as sort of the what and the why of behavior. So data scientists are often exploring and kind of explaining what's happening. So they're looking at a bunch of patterns in behavior that they are kind of reading in data, but they will often look to a behavioral scientist to say like, here's something that we're seeing. We're not sure why this is happening. And then similarly, what could we do to change this behavior? You might then work again with the data science team to measure the impact of a design change. You'll see behavioral science often as part of internal human resources, human capital, employee engagement initiatives. This might be something like uptake of benefits programs. It might be something around like change management internally within an organization. So you'll see either people with behavioral science or like IO psychology degrees in those roles, or you might actually have somebody with the title behavioral scientist that's embedded within one of these teams. Behavioral science also has like a pretty meaningful impact on strategy. So I think of this as less about sort of getting the strategy exactly right and more about ensuring that you don't miss something really big or have a big misstep early on in when you're forming strategy. So we often look for are there things in the literature that would say that there's like a gap in our strategy, or we're about to sort of place a big bet and we think this sort of is not aligned with how people typically behave or what we would anticipate it when we make a change like this. Another commonplace, especially like I would say maybe 5 or 10 years ago, to see behavioral science was paired with innovation. And this is sort of, there's sort of trade-offs to any of these like placements. With innovation, you typically have more latitude to try different things. You're often kind of like a little bit adjacent to the business or the organization already because you have a mandate to sort of do new stuff. The risk of being kind of within an innovation team or part of the organization is innovation teams are almost always like struggling to like integrate their ideas back into the organization. And behavioral science is already kind of like an sort of esoteric or niche thing. And so when you're like paired with innovation, sometimes you get kind of lumped together and people are just like, I don't really know what these guys are doing. But you'll often see behavioral science partnered with innovation, and there's a lot of useful application of behavioral science within innovation, particularly around like the evaluation of ideas, the focus on experimentation and kind of validation. Another very common place to see behavioral science is within research and insights. So conducting research, producing insights. This is something that behavioral science already does. And so this is a natural place to sort of say, hey, we want to have a behavioral scientist or a behavioral science team focus on this. And to some extent, this is a decision that you would make as you're building out a team, is to what extent are you kind of focused on research versus some of these other aspects of, design, consultative skills. You'll be doing kind of all of these things to some extent, but you'll often end up kind of leaning more on one than the other. And then finally, risk management, is a place where you'll often see behavioral science show up in helping an organization mitigate risk or understand risk and risk perception better. So I will maybe pause there real quick. That's sort of like the quick semi-intro. The rest of this is really focused on, okay, this is where, organizations often place a behavioral scientist or a behavioral science team. Now, how do they do that, and how can we sort of do it well? But I'll pause real quick just for any questions or anything that you all have popped in the chat. All right.
It seems like the chat is quiet so far, so maybe it was you're just a very clear explainer.
Well, I'll say these first couple slides are pretty sort of introductory. So, okay. So then how do organizations use behavioral science? There are three aspects of that I'll kind of talk through here, and would love your ideas or questions related to these. So the first is hiring and organizing a team. So how do you actually kind of build a capability? The second is you typically then need to develop some sort of maturity on how you conduct research, either within your team or kind of moving your organization along with this as well. And then you have to figure out, how do you choose the right projects to work on? So hiring and organizing a team, there are really kind of three primary structures that you'll see. So the first is this individual contributor, kind of lone wolf, and the image that I chose here. This is where most organizations start, right? So it's pretty unusual to start by saying, oh, we're going to go hire 5 behavioral scientists. They usually bring in one person. There's like a stakeholder, somebody who's particularly a senior person within an organization that's excited about behavioral science. Based on their understanding, they will go and hire someone and say, hey, you're our behavioral scientist, or you're a lead behavioral science lead, or something like that. And then that person has a ton of autonomy, also kind of responsibility to build out that practice. So this is one person that's really kind of trying to wear a bunch of different hats. They're typically, they have to obviously have expertise in behavioral science. They're often, pretty good at kind of like communicating the science as well, like public speaking, giving talks, being very kind of compelling, almost sort of selling behavioral science within the organization. They often, will be the one doing all the research as well. So you're kind of expected to be a pretty competent researcher, a good networker, and this is often kind of hard for one person to do. The second model, kind of once you expand from being an individual contributor, is basically you can have a centralized team. This is probably what you normally think of when you think of a behavioral science team. So this is, a group of folks who have training in behavioral science. They all kind of sit together within the organization, and they go and sort of work on projects together. So when they show up as the behavioral science team. And then the third one here, this kind of integrated function, is where you have behavioral scientists who are embedded in different functional areas across an organization, and they may or may not have like kind of connections to each other, but they are much more like part of the marketing team, part of the digital product team, part of the policy team. And they are typically kind of like a senior person who serves as like the behavioral science resource for that team in that area. So I'll talk about kind of each of these in a little bit more detail. So the individual contributor can be pretty effective at building awareness of behavioral science and advocating for its use. That's kind of like their main job when they're the one behavioral scientist within an organization. The obvious sort of constraint is a resource constraint. You're one person, right? So you may have kind of negotiated for a budget to bring on some consultants, or you might have partnered with like academic researchers or something like that to try to expand that capacity. But basically, you're one person trying to do a bunch of different things. So you want to be really kind of thoughtful and purposeful about what you work on, because you can contribute significantly, but really only to a few key things. And then, you want to think about how do you expand that influence. So beyond just sort of like direct consultative, time, you can build and socialize frameworks, tools, maybe to some extent like education or training to guide the internal use of behavioral science within the organization that you're supporting. You're probably going to struggle with like scaling your work across the organization. It's really hard to scale when you're just one person. You also are probably going to struggle having really a significant influence on the strategic direction of the organization, just as sort of a one individual. Again, the resource constraint is going to make it hard to actually go through like a rigorous behavioral science process in a bunch of different places. Unless it's like the only thing you do, you don't really want to spend all of your time training other people on how to use behavioral science in their roles. It's kind of a little counterintuitive, I guess. It's something that people, I'll say this is my opinion on it, I guess. People are often excited about it and they'll ask for that. It is good at maybe getting sort of a baseline level of understanding and application of behavioral science. But it's not going to you're not going to turn everybody into behavioral scientists within the organization. So that can end up being like a pretty significant amount of time that you spend on that. And it may not have the impact that you hope that it will. So that's a little bit about kind of this lone wolf sort of individual contributor. The centralized team can be effective when it serves as a center of excellence for the organization. Often this is as like a research, and maybe there's like some design kind of components to it as well, but usually this is like a team of behavioral science researchers that are tasked with answering behavioral science questions that the organization cares about. So you might work with leaders in the organization to sort of understand pressing needs, things that aren't being answered elsewhere, and then you'll kind of go and produce guidance, research, tools, etc., that other parts of the organization use to infuse behavioral science in the work that they're doing. So you provide guidance on something that gets used by a product design team or by a policy team as they do their work. There are a couple other benefits of the centralized team. You often have a lot more kind of morale boosting and kind of camaraderie with a centralized team because all of your behavioral scientists are working together, so they get to know each other and learn from each other's expertise. When you do have like everybody kind of housed in one place, you end up with often like a more sort of diverse set of experience training within the team. So that's usually better for ideation. Often you can produce kind of better, concepts because of that. And people enjoy, learning from and working with each other. However, you often struggle with establishing ownership and accountability for the core aspects of things that the organization does. So this is not like a behavioral science problem. This is a consulting problem. So businesses typically, or I'll say organizations typically, they don't put consultants in charge of like core things that they do. You give consultants jobs that are like, hey, I want your opinion on this. Hey, I want your guidance on this. I may or may not use it. For any of you who are consultants or who have been, I was a consultant for many years. That is just kind of part of the job typically, right? And so you learn pretty quickly, is this something that you enjoy about it? You like the diversity of projects, you like the variety. And it may or may not matter too much if the organizations that you work with actually implement the things that you do with fidelity or the way that you would do them. That's kind of up to them, right? When you're an external consultant, that's not really a big deal, right? You have pretty clear signals of, did you do a good job or not, right? Basically, like the expectations are really clear of what you're supposed to do, deliver some recommendations, deliver a prototype, whatever. And the signal of, hey, did you do a good job is basically like, did you get hired again, right? When you're internal, it's a lot less clear of, well, you're already part of the organization. So like, did you get hired again or not? That's like not always very obvious. And it is also not as obvious that people don't have to listen to your recommendations when you're an internal consultant. You sort of think, hey, we're all in the same organization. I did this work for you. You never implemented the stuff that our team sent over. In most cases, they're not really obligated to do that, but it's not obvious at first. So that can be pretty frustrating for folks, I think, if you're not kind of clear-eyed about what the model is that you're working in. Through our nonprofit, Bessie, we ran a survey of behavioral scientists a few years ago. It was like several hundred teams that responded. And we asked people, what are the biggest challenges that you face? And we asked them a bunch of questions about the type of team, type of organization that they were in. And for consultants, we had sort of a, consulting external, consulting internal. And for external consultants, the number one challenge was basically like, I just don't think that, the organizations that I work with actually follow through on the recommendations that I make. And for internal teams, they were like, I know they don't follow through on the recommendations that I make because I work here and I can see what they're doing. So one, that can be kind of frustrating, right, to folks on the team. But two, if there's not a clear understanding across leadership within the organization, you'll often get questions of like, well, what's the impact that the team has? What's the, like, show me like where you're responsible for a change in the, the business or a change in the effectiveness of this program or whatever. But if your role is really just providing recommendations or conducting research that may or may not get used in future design or strategy, you really can't be, you're not like accountable for that, right? And so you'll often it'll be hard to produce something to say like, here's what we actually did that had this demonstrable impact. So those are some of the pros and cons of the centralized team. Integrated function, you'll kind of see some trade-offs here, but basically, an integrated or an embedded behavioral scientist can be effective at essentially demonstrating greater impact because they're often given more ownership and accountability for some key part of the organization or the team. So when a behavioral scientist is actually like part of the digital product team, for example, they will have an objective or a metric or a KPI or whatever that is essentially like the same as that product team. It's much more core to the organization and what they're doing, as opposed to, I produced X number of research reports, I built X number of prototypes or whatever. It's something that is already kind of integrated into what the business or what the organization is trying to do. I'm using the terms business and organization kind of interchangeably here. Some of these insights are broader for other types of organizations. I kind of default to business because I spend most of my time working in business, but I'm happy to talk about some of the nuances of that too, if it's useful. So whereas when you're on this sort of centralized kind of consultative team, you often get more breadth across a variety of different projects, a variety of different parts of the organization. When you are integrated within a function, you develop a much deeper expertise in that key area. In fact, when you're hiring for a role like this, you often are looking for somebody who already has dual expertise, both as a behavioral scientist and in whatever that domain is, whether it's marketing or whatever the case may be. That ends up being pretty challenging. So that's kind of a struggle with this model, is like finding the right person or type of person as a match for the right team is pretty critical. And there's not like thousands of these folks out there, right? So that becomes challenging to do. And then of course you want to retain those people. I mean, this is sort of true of any behavioral science initiative or anything where you're kind of building out a capability, but like maintaining sponsorship is really important. And so thinking through how you keep momentum going for these embedded or integrated roles when you have like turnover of a key sponsor, this can work out positively as well. So sometimes they move to a new area and they want to bring a behavioral scientist to that area as well. But you typically, if you're like leading a team, you have to kind of do a fair amount of work with stakeholders, when someone new is coming in, making sure they understand what the value is, what you're doing, and all of that stuff. And, when you're on a shared, kind of centralized team with a bunch of behavioral scientists, you can lean a little bit more on each other's shared knowledge of the organization and, expertise, so you can call on people a little bit easier and things like that. So those are the three kind of like most common structures that I'll see, but I'll say there's not really like a right way of doing it. And it really is driven by the needs and the constraints of the organization. So oftentimes you kind of start in one place and you sort of evolve with the organization. It's really common to, as I mentioned, to start with this sort of solo practitioner, kind of like lone wolf approach, and then evolve into one of these other things as a centralized team, integrated function, or as a hybrid, where you kind of do a little bit of both and you try to get the best of both worlds. These aren't necessarily super prescriptive of the only ways you can do it. And depending on what the organization is trying to do and the skills that already exist, you might prioritize or choose one approach over another. A typical sort of evolution of that looks like you spend the first, period of time, maybe it's a year, kind of educating and evangelizing. It really just depends on like how much momentum you have going into it. So you'll often have started with like one key sponsor, someone who's like, I think behavioral science is important. I want you to come here and build a capability around it. Okay, great. You should probably identify a few other sponsors or build more sponsors. So these are like senior folks within an organization who are interested in behavioral science, who also have the ability to further the capability. Usually that means by like commissioning work, giving resources to do that, whether that's headcount or funding or things like that. You'll probably give a ton of talks early on. You run around giving intro to behavioral science. Here's what it is. Here's what we do. So you'll have kind of like a roadshow deck for that. There's lots of like tips, I guess, related to that I won't really get into here, but essentially you're kind of balancing, like you're trying to set expectations too. I think a kind of common mistake is like going in with too many sort of showy, kind of nudgy type things. You may end up not actually doing that much of that type of work within an organization, and you don't really want to overpromise like, oh, we're just going to do a couple like defaults, easy changes and have these huge impacts, right? You're probably like, taking some of those tools from that solo practitioner approach, building frameworks, tools. You're basically trying to kind of create excitement and buy-in and understand what your network looks like for this. As you do that, you'll then start to you will want to start then kind of piloting and sort of demonstrating the impact of behavioral science. and promoting that. So looking for projects where you can do demonstrations, and we'll talk in a minute about like kind of choosing the right projects. Sharing the success stories from that and things that you've learned, how the capability is evolving, where you see it going. The goal of that is really driving demand for more behavioral science work, and orienting the work towards impact. That demand you then kind of start to convert into resources for behavioral science capabilities. So usually that means people to help do the work. And then finally, you're creating more capacity, right? So this is hiring behavioral scientists as the demand grows, placing that expertise in other roles and other teams. So what I mean here is like, in some instances, it's beneficial to have like a product manager who understands behavioral science, or a leader in data science that understands behavioral science. So it can be kind of an effective strategy at times to help like with the hiring and other parts of the organization, even though those aren't like quote unquote behavioral science roles. If you plan on conducting experiments and doing more research, like that is often very costly within an organization in terms of like time, coordination. There may not be tools or infrastructure in place to support that. So investing in that or helping others kind of invest in that to lower the cost and increase the speed of experimentation is often a valuable investment. And then you may or may not partner with outside academics for complex projects or for other types of initiatives where it sort of benefits from that rigor or brand association of we're partnering with an academic institution on this. So that's all kind of about like team structure-y things. Maybe I'll pause again just for any questions or thoughts before I kind of move on to the next two pieces here of research maturity and choosing the right projects.
I mean, I've got a question for you, but it's not a particularly nice one. So obviously we know you have this evolution of a unit, and as you said, it does help if you've got multiple sponsors. But of course, there are examples of units that essentially follow this criterion or this journey, if you will, and then they got disbanded. So do you have like a couple of core ways to prevent that to some extent, or do you think it's even feasible for when a unit gets disbanded for behavioral science ever to be reintegrated into a company like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a couple things can help with that. I mean, one is going back to like one of the first slides around why do organizations use behavioral science. Producing insights that have a meaningful impact on the firm or the organization really is like the first, and I think the best kind of defense against that, right? So showing that you're having like a meaningful impact is often like a sort of powerful answer to like why you should continue to exist as a team or really like grow as a team, right? Or a capability. So if you find that you're doing things where you're like, oh, it's going to be really hard to show that we have an impact here, or this is sometimes you'll get asked to work on stuff that's like it's not really relevant to or it's not aligned to kind of like I'll say loosely aligned to the strategic goals of the firm. Those are often things to kind of politely decline or put on a backlog. Essentially, like if you think about like, and in some organizations this is easier than others, but if there are a few key like metrics that the organization cares about. So let's say it's like one of them is revenue, right? That's often a common one in a business. So say, okay, we want to increase revenue or we want to decrease costs or something like that. There are going to be lots of things that are oriented towards those within the organization. And some of them are very like directly oriented, right? Pricing, pretty directly contribute, like the theory of change of like, do we change prices and what does that do to our revenue or to our profit? There's a pretty clear link there. And you could say, well, there's a behavioral component to pricing as well. So working on something like that is kind of an easier yes, because you can sort of demonstrate the impact much more clearly, as opposed to say something that's like, help us optimize like a subject line in an email to increase signups for a training that we think will lead to a better customer experience in a store, and we think the better customer experience in the store is going to lead to higher, sales. Lots of threads to follow here, of like, what this is pretty far away from actually like kind of having an impact. So that's like, I think, kind of thing number one. Number two, and I think this is the less obvious one, is I alluded to kind of this like hybrid structure of an organization or of a capability, where you have some folks that are kind of centralized and some that are embedded. I think to some extent that can also be a good stopgap for like disbanding a team or something like that, because typically those integrated roles there's a much greater like sense of ownership from the team that they work in. So if they're supporting marketing or if they're supporting digital product design or whatever, those areas often fund those roles, and then they feel much more ownership of them. So there's a couple benefits to it. The one that I talked about earlier was like accountability and impact. So that's already good for like kind of telling the story of what, the benefit of behavioral science. The other is that it means that the budget for the team is often like structured in a way that it's a little bit harder to just sort of say like, oh, we're kind of like going to just sort of wipe all of this away. Because several of the roles may have been maybe funded by other areas. So this is kind of like a little bit more of a technical answer, but I think it does become kind of important within an organization when you think about like how headcount gets assigned and how funding works. But that's a great question. And then
Vishal actually also put a question in the chat. So Vishal, for context, is a consultant. And as a result, he occasionally meets people in organizations who want quick wins with behavioral science, like a one-hit wonder to look clever. I then apply my skills to convince them that they don't need my snake oil, very nicely phrased. Question, when should organizations not use behavioral science, or what are the warning signs that the culture of an organization does not really support applying behavioral science properly?
Yeah, great question. So I'll actually just jump forward a couple slides, because we kind of get to this when we talk about like choosing the right projects. So so it's a great question that it sort of makes sense when you think about like, I'll often hear, or in conversations with behavioral scientists, folks sort of lament that organizations or, leaders or folks that we chat with are like, oh, they want, just like something easy that is going to have like a big impact and not be very challenging or expensive to implement. And it's like, well, yeah, of course, if that's an option, then yeah, I'll choose that every time. And we probably haven't done ourselves a ton of favors in behavioral science of like highlighting so many use cases that sort of speak to those types of things. I kind of alluded to this a little bit in like when I said you'll go and give a lot of talks. Oftentimes, if I'm giving examples within those talks, I try to vary the examples to have things that are sort of quick hit, more like nudgy interface design, form design, things like that, changes, as well as things that are kind of longer term. And so I think it's maybe less about, I think of it less as like kind of a culture that would support behavioral science, and more of like finding the right fit with the right like business problem. So the way that I kind of go about doing this is first like look for kind of 5 elements that I think make a pretty compelling business case. So the first is that it has to be aligned to the goals of the organization and the strategy of the organization. So I kind of alluded to this a moment ago in the answer to your question, Meryl, about, you'll want to show that you're having impact in something that's actually meaningful. So when we drove a 1,000% increase in signups to happy hour, like, okay, well, I guess that's kind of neat, but it's not really impactful, right? So the way that I describe this often is like, we don't work on behavioral science projects and behavioral science problems. We work on like business projects, business goals, business problems. So we adopt the objectives of our partners when we do work, as opposed to having some like behavioral science thing in mind and then going and trying to convince people that that's what they should do. We ask, what's the most important thing you're doing? And then there's almost always a behavioral component to it. So we start with like alignment to strategy. Then you need some stakeholder engagement and likely like sponsorship of that. So it doesn't really matter if it's a great idea if the person who's accountable for it or that person's boss's boss doesn't want to do it. So that sponsorship has to be in place. You have to be able to measure impact in some way. That doesn't necessarily mean you're running an experiment, but you have to be able to show that that whatever happened is different and better because they use behavioral science or because they use your team. Has to be feasible. So you can spend a long time kind of noodling on ideas and talking about interesting things. But the rubber will meet the road at some point. And so it's usually helpful to know sooner rather than later, like, is this even possible? And then finally, like, what are the good, like, are there good leverage points to apply behavioral science within this problem? So I would encourage you to always start with like the things that are the most important to the organization, and then kind of work through these aspects to say like, well, what's a compelling kind of business case here? So I'm just going to check the chat. Blood pressure and behavioral science to be predictive. Yeah, it's a great point, Sharon. And we often have questions about that of like, what can it predict? And I usually like shy away from using that language. Really the only place where we kind of think about that more is sometimes in like strategy work, where you're looking at sort of like things farther onto the future and sort of trying to say like, do we think this is more or less likely? But I rarely like frame things in terms of like, oh, we're going to predict what someone's going to do here. I'll probably talk about more in terms of like likelihood of this or that. But I try to kind of pull out as much of the language that sounds too like magical or too good to be true, as a way of kind of helping manage expectations for our partners. So it often helps early on as you're building out the body of work to think of the projects contributing to a portfolio of work. And there's a risk sometimes of, if you're doing kind of one thing at a time, you get sort of pigeonholed a little bit. So, oh, we just do, A/B testing on the website. We just do, research projects related to, consumer insights or something like that. So having a variety of things in a portfolio that includes both like short-term initiatives, that's kind of like the quick hit type stuff, and longer term initiatives is usually pretty helpful just to sort of have a healthy balance. And then finally, projects should pass an ethics checklist. It doesn't have to be this exact checklist, but these are some of the questions that we kind of came up with when we were pulling this book together. And it's essentially like, if you were at a university, there would be an institutional review board that would look at kind of the ethics of the initiatives that you're working on. in an organization like a company, usually that is kind of like a combination of you'll have a legal team, you might have a compliance team, and you may have like a brand and reputation team, and they're kind of like serving to some extent that function. But it helps to probably have your own kind of version of this for your behavioral science work as well. So, thinking about these components, I think is helpful in terms of choosing the right projects to work on or to get started on. So with that, maybe I'll pause for other questions. And then I'll give a quick little note that happy to give you all a little bonus gift here. I'll drop it in the chat, but anyone who would like a download of our book that a lot of this kind of content came from, happy to share that with you. I'll just...
That is very kind. Thank you very much. I'm sure people in the chat would be very, very happy with that. Before, reading through the entire book, are there any immediate questions coming from, the talk that we just had? Well, I feel like it might be that a lot of people are just going to try to digest what they've just heard.
Yeah.
Any questions, comments, concerns? Ooh, there's a question on
Explored measuring
measurement.
behavioral science capability. Helen, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
I can,
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, hi. No, it's just that we're interested in, I'm coming from the Behavioural Insights Unit in New South Wales government, and we're just looking at how we can actually help different teams or organisations sort of baseline their level of behavioural science capability and then measure it over time. So yeah, we're working in that space at the moment.
Yeah, that's a great question and a great idea. And I have not really done that before. I mean, I guess the thoughts that kind of come to mind are the way I often describe it to folks is because we'll often get requests to do like develop a training or something like that. Like, can you help us do more behavioral science in our work or be better at behavioral science in our work? And so the way that I often describe it is like, think of it as like giving a presentation or something like that. Like there are lots of things that we do to help people give better presentations. Like we give them templates to use when they're making a slide deck. You can do a training on how to give a good presentation and something like that. At a certain point, you probably just need a graphic designer to come in and do something for you, right? And so I would think of it maybe somewhat similarly, like where there is like a baseline level of knowledge that you might want to say, okay, across this organization or department, we want people to have some level of fluency in behavioral science kind of concepts or framework or something like that. There may be specific roles within the organization that you say, we want to do like a little bit of additional training or work with to upskill within a certain specific activity or give them a specific tool to help with this. And then there may be areas where you want to embed a behavioral scientist to say, okay, you also just have a behavioral scientist that's part of your evaluation team or that's part of your design team. So that is probably how I would think about that, but I haven't actually put that into like a sort of framework before,
Yeah.
or like a maturity model or something like that.
Yeah, thank you. That's kind of where we were thinking as well. We'd even thought along the lines of the COM-B model, and in terms of making sure an organization has trying to manage their measure capabilities, so skills, and then the environment or the opportunity that they actually have to apply it, and then their motivation. So their understanding of why they might want to be doing that. So
yeah, I mean, we do something. I've done something similar with like creating a tool for either for like people who are designing things to kind of go through and evaluate on a couple different dimensions. I mean, my experience with that so far has been it's really just like it's something I kind of changed how I think about it too. Because at first I was like, oh, we'll create this tool that will like empower people to do behavioral science in their own work. I think in practice, it becomes like a marketing tool for your behavioral science team because people use it a little bit and then they like pretty quickly are like, oh, like, did I do this right? Or, oh, I'm not sure. Like, I have a question about this. And they want to talk to a behavioral scientist. We've had lots of conversations over the years with different groups where it's like, ooh, like, is this a problem if we give some people like a little bit of training or a little bit like, is this a little bit worse than none at all because they get too confident? I'm sure that happens sometimes, but in most of the instances that I've kind of encountered, people do not get overconfident with it. They either sort of don't really use it or they start to, and then they're like, oh, hey, can I just ask you a quick question? And the quick question is like, can you come in and do this project for me?
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. And I'm keen to have a look at the download that you're able to share. And I think I might even reply to someone in the thread who's offered themselves as a work with us.
Yeah. Well, keep me posted if you do something along those lines. I'd be curious to learn more.
Thank you so much.
Yes, there is in
course.
the chat, and that will probably have to be the last one with regards to time, because I know everyone is now dipping out of lunch into their next meeting, as it is 1 p.m. for us now. Sarah has put in very interesting to hear, but that is also in relation to Helen. They would be very happy to be guinea pigs for you in the NSW EPA. So there you go. You've got your guinea pigs going if you're keen. Guys, it's now 1 p.m. I hope you've had a fabulous lunch. I know I had a fabulous time listening to this presso, so thank you very, very much. As always, we will be back again next month, always the last Thursday of the month, probably the same time, unless we have someone from a completely different region and it turns out to be horrific with regards to the time difference, although much worse than Zarak's time difference couldn't be, because for him, I think it's currently 11 p.m. So again, thank you very much for doing a presentation at such an ungodly hour. Thank God it's at least before midnight. And for everyone else, we hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.